Just so you know, will the speaker be spotlighted as well? Otherwise, they will only see the interpreter. Just so you know.
Good morning, good evening. Welcome our online viewers to today's session titled Gender Responsive and Disability Inclusive Education for All, a Global Education Summit event. In the chat box, please introduce yourselves in this order: your name, the country you're coming from, and what you are hoping to learn from the session. For today's event, we have captioning available in English, French, Spanish, Arabic, and we have international sign language interpretation. We are putting a link to the streaming link for captioning in the chat box for you to access the various languages. For English captions, you also have the option to click on CC at the bottom of the Zoom screen and turn on subtitles. We want this event to be as much interactive with participants. So post your questions in the Zoom Q&A function or in the chat feed on the right-hand side of the screen. We will answer them during that session. I would like now to introduce to you, my fellow co-chair, Charlotte McLean-Nilapo, who will be co-chairing today's session with myself. Charlotte is Global Disability Advisor of the World Bank Group. As Disability Advisor, she focuses on working with and supporting operational teams across the institution to ensure that bank policies, programs, and projects take people with disabilities into consideration. Before joining the World Bank, she served as USAID's Coordinator for Disability and Inclusive Development, appointed by the US President Barack Obama in 2011 to lead the government's efforts in disability inclusive development, from developing policies and country strategies to technical assistance for program implementation. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon to all the guests. What I'd like to do right now is to start off with a brief introduction of Sarah to the audience. Sarah is an experienced global youth with disability advocate. She has held multiple influential positions, including co-founding her own Gifted Community Center for Youth with Disabilities in Nairobi, Kenya. Sarah has also collaborated with the Global Business Coalition for Education Youth Advisory Council, with the United Nations Population Fund based in New York, the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network, and the FCDO. Sarah is currently a PhD student studying diplomacy and international affairs, and it's great to be able to co-chair this session with you today, Sarah. I'd like to now pivot to provide some information for today's event. This event is co-convened by Leonard, Cheshire, Sight Savers, the Global Partnership for Education, the Global Campaign for Education, UN Girls Education Initiative, and the World Bank's Inclusive Education Initiative, the IEI. The event will showcase examples of education models and finance mechanisms that ensure girls with disabilities have access to quality, inclusive education and remain in school. The speakers will discuss the barriers and opportunities to their learning and present a set of recommendations for key stakeholders to take forward to the Global Education Summit to ensure the inclusion of girls with disabilities in education planning. So over the next 90 minutes, we will hear from young persons with disabilities, NGO representatives, government ministry representatives, and leaders in the promotion of inclusivity for persons with disabilities from around the world. Today, we have come together to advance the need for action to governments and to the donor community to strengthen the financing and policies that promote access to education for girls with disabilities in the aftermath of the pandemic. The World Bank is most proud to be part of this event and is committed to ensuring that education is inclusive of girls with disabilities. We know that the completion rates, enrollment rates, and literacy rates of girls with disabilities are below those of their peers who are male or do not have a disability. And while progress was being made pre-pandemic, we also know that the pandemic has reversed many of those gains and in some instances halted much of the progress. Recently, the Inclusive Education Initiative, the IEI, that is hosted at the World Bank, conducted a survey that looked at the supports that children with disabilities had while schools were closed during the pandemic of COVID-19. Some of the findings that came out of that study were specific to girls with disabilities. So allow me to share a few of those with you to really kickstart our discussion today. The first was that when resources are limited, girls, and especially girls with disabilities, are less likely to have access to those resources. And those resources may be technology, they may be books, or whatever it is that they need to further their education while at home. Many parents and teachers reported being concerned that their male siblings and siblings without disabilities would have priority access and that girls with disabilities would be excluded and left behind. The second finding was that girls with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to abuse while out of school. Research shows that gender-based violence has increased in many parts of the world during the pandemic. The intersectionality of gender and disability creates further risks for girls with disabilities. And finally, as a result of COVID-19, many respondents to a survey conducted by the IEI were concerned that girls with disabilities in particular were at risk of not returning to school if they were not deliberately included in the planning and financing of their education. This final point is especially critical to consider as we delve into today's discussion and deliberate what recommendations can be made to ensure the inclusion of girls with disabilities in education. I want to now turn to Helen Grant, the UK Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Girls' Education, who will open our session and outline the British government's commitment towards girls' education as recently announced during the G7 summit in Cornwall, with a specific focus on girls with disabilities. So welcome, Helen, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Charlotte. I hope everybody can hear me, see me. I've had a few technical problems this morning in some earlier events, but it's really great to be with you today for this important discussion on disability inclusive education for all. As many of you will know, 2021 is a major year for us in the UK. We're presidents of the G7 and the COP26, and co-hosting the Global Education Summit, which starts officially next Wednesday. All of these are watershed moments with big opportunities to shine a spotlight on the importance of girls' education, how transformational it can be, and the barriers, of course, that still do exist. I'm hugely honoured to be the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Girls' Education. My role is to champion his message that providing every girl on the planet with 12 years of quality education is one of the best ways of tackling many of the major issues facing the world today, such as poverty, climate change, and inequality. Investing in girls' education is an absolute game changer. If you want to change the world for the better, girls' education for sure is the best place to start. A child of a mother who can read is 50% more likely to live beyond the age of 5 years, twice as likely to attend school themselves, and 50% more likely to be immunised. Girls who are educated are more able to choose if, when, and how many children they have. Girls' education is therefore vital for women and girls in terms of their own self-empowerment, but also in levelling up society, boosting incomes, and developing economies and nations. Even before COVID-19, girls with disabilities face severe barriers in accessing education, healthcare, social protection, and financial assistance. Tragically, the pandemic has made a bad situation even worse, disrupting the learning of 1.6 billion children at the peak of the pandemic in 2020. Long school closures have undermined years of progress in building gender-responsive and inclusive education systems. Many children with disabilities, in consequence, will never return to school or even start school, lowering their chances of future employment and decent livelihoods. Out-of-school girls are also, as we've heard, at greater risk of violence, sexual abuse, early marriage, forced marriage, FGM, human trafficking. All of this creating a very real risk of a lost generation of girls. And we must work hard and we must work together to stop this from happening. In the UK, at part of our education work are a set of global targets. These target getting 20 million more girls read by the age of 10 and 40 million more girls in primary and secondary schools in low and lower middle income countries by 2026. I'm delighted that G7 leaders endorsed these global targets at the Leaders Summit just last month, a key milestone on our journey to 12 years quality education for every girl in the world. As we set out to achieve these ambitious targets, we will keep marginalised girls, including girls with disabilities, at the centre of our policy and programming. At FCDO, we use a twin track approach to inclusive education. This effectively means that we provide targeted support for learners with disabilities, and we seek to improve mainstream education systems to make sure that they're inclusive. This approach has allowed us, through our Girls' Education Challenge, to help 100,000 girls with disabilities receive an education in countries such as Kenya, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe. I know the weight of the challenge with girls' education is significant, but our ability to make change in the world, if we work together, should never be underestimated. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for those opening remarks, Helen, and thank you for spotlighting and highlighting the importance of addressing marginalized girls, in particular girls with disabilities. Now, before we turn to the various sessions we have planned for today, we would like to show you a quick video from UN Angai and Leonard Cheshire on girls with disabilities having equal right to education.
The COVID-19 pandemic has widened inequalities in education, particularly for young women and girls with disabilities. We have 9 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. What governments decide to do now will impact the lives of millions of girls with disabilities. We talked to gender equality and inclusive education advocates, and this is what they had to say. What does education mean for you?
Education has helped me to realize my rights and dreams, without which I wouldn't have been what I am today.
We girls with disabilities need education, which is the key to success, so that we can be who we want to be in future. Education is everything to us and to our lives.
Elimu kwangu ina muhimu kwa sababu inanisaidia kufikia malengo yangu.
Although I have Down syndrome, I have written and published 4 books. This is what going to school means to me.
Going to school meant to me be a normal child, not a child with disabilities only, and not a patient. And that was one of the most important values of education, that it gave me a sense of being equal.
Girls with disability have an equal right to education.
In a critical year for progress towards the right to education for every girl, G7 Summit, GPE Summit, COP26 Summit, we must build back better, equal and inclusive. Girls with disabilities have an equal right to education.
Okay, we've heard earlier, Helen Grant reaffirmed the commitment of the United Kingdom government at ensuring that all education development will be inclusive of girls and that barriers towards accessing quality learning opportunities and remaining in school so as to complete a full trajectory of quality education would become a reality, irrespective of where they live and learn. There's no doubt that girls' education is a determinant of successful economic and social growth and development in any country, and is also critical for the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. Most impactful, cost-effective, and proven way forward. We now want to introduce our panel of women activists to give their view on what the barriers are that they themselves and girls with disabilities have faced and still face in realizing their right to education. Our panelists' profile include Gertrude Oforiwa, who is the Gender and Disability Rights Advocate at UNCRPD. We have Shirutlata Singh, Youth Advocate at Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network, CCYDN. And then we have Daniela Golden, young activist in the American Institute of Disability and Inclusive Development. So this session will be a one barrier, one solution session, and our panelists, you will have 3 minutes to tell us a critical barrier that you've experienced in getting into school, and also suggest one solution on how inclusive education can be realized for all girls with disabilities, especially those who live in low and middle income countries. My first panelist is Shirutlata Singh, Youth Advocate. Welcome.
Thank you for this opportunity for today to share here. Children and young people with disability have always faced difficulty in accessing education, healthcare, and other services. Most of the time, they are not able to voice for themselves because of the lack of awareness about their rights and needs, which makes them most vulnerable and deprived, whether it is about accessing education, healthcare, and socialization. Even before the pandemic, in most countries, there has been a lack of inclusive environment, both in mainstream as well as special schools. There is lack of infrastructure and technologies to support education of children and young people with disabilities. This pandemic has doubled the challenges faced by people with disability in accessing education, because everything is now in online mode. It is a known fact that vast population of the people with disability are from economically weaker background because of their poor health condition, and so they are not able to afford technologies like smartphone. In addition to this, their family are not able to support them even if they do have smartphone because of the lack of knowledge about accessibility and technical information. Apart from all this, there are people who depend on residual census to access education now. And online education is very stressful to them, which is leading to health issues. This is the lack of accessibility is not just causing children and young people with disability to drop out of education, but it is also leading to mental health problem because they also have to stop socializing. When we talk about education of girls, it is quite different story. Girls in general have faced many inequalities. In many countries, the education of girls are not given much importance, and they are not even given scholarships. They are made to work household work, which again keeps them from accessing education. Children with intellectual problems are much stressed because of the prolonged confinement at home, and their learnings have been hampered. This pandemic has caused many of the students with disability to drop out of to give up their education, and now they face an uncertain future. Commonwealth Network of Children and Youth with Disability was established in 2019 following the Global Disability Summit and Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2018, whereby strong need for having a network of children and youth with disability was felt so that they can have a say in all decision making. CCYDN works globally in partnership with other NGOs and DPOs to advocate for the rights of children and young people with disability on all legal basis. During the Global Disability Summit, Global Charter on Rights of Children and Young People with Disability was launched, which has a total of 10 commitments, and its first commitment is dedicated to ensuring accessible, inclusive education. Last year, when this pandemic broke out, CCYDN drafted a global recommendation to ensure that rights of children and young people with disability remain protected during this critical time. And it has a total of 12 recommendations, and its first recommendation addresses all this issue faced in accessing online education and recommends way forward by providing alternate solution for providing guidance and some technical support to caregiver and guardians. Through Sense India's National Network of Adults with Deaf Blindness, I have been able to engage youth with deaf blindness in global initiatives of CCYDN. I urge every organization present here to sign up for this recommendation to ensure that rights of children and young people with disability are protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiroti. Our next panelist is Gender and Disability Rights Advocate at UNCRPD. Welcome, Gertrude Oforiwa.
Thank you very much. Greetings to all. From my experience and from practice, I want to highlight discrimination. Girls with disabilities make up a substantial share out of school children. And we agree that COVID has really worsened the situation for many girls. And for girls with disabilities, they are at a greater risk of lost learning. And in fact, many of them are not likely to return to school. But more seriously, girls are not likely to be in school because of some reasons, a barrier because of the negative social discriminatory attitudes toward disability and gender norms. In many African countries and in our cultures, men are placed at the center of authority, so boys matter. Boys' education is seen as more economically viable. And so they would want to invest in it. Girls are not seen as worthy as compared to boys. And this cultural norm really is a disadvantage in rural communities. So girls are expected to focus on housekeeping, looking after the family, and are forced into marriage, pregnancy, they're abused, and it results in many girls with disabilities not having the confidence they require and self-belief. So schools with poor infrastructure and accessibility means girls with disabilities don't have the privacy or dignity to use basic services. And it can be very difficult for a young woman during puberty age. And this, worst of all, with the sexual abuse, experiences sexual violence at home, in their community, on the way to school and from school. So sexual and gender-based violence for girls with disabilities is much worse. Girls with disabilities are seen as helpless, asexual, powerless, and therefore are extremely abused, and it's bad to hear about residential schools. And also those with particular impairments where they cannot to report abuse quickly are at more risk. Young girls and our family are therefore scared to send their daughters to school for fear of their safety. And so this has shown to prevent girls with disability from going to school and taking their opportunity, which are equal for others. The solutions include the fact that there should be an intersectional approach to education strategies that acknowledge disability and gender as both cross-cutting issues. We need to value the power of community, government, donors, NGOs, and all education actors. And these need to talk to the communities and start from the grassroots so that together we can increase the awareness raising and opportunity for social learning to change attitude and negative stereotypes. And this must also go throughout the education systems. And community life must be important as well. So community awareness mobilization led by key community actors are critical to ensure behavior and behavioral change. Parents need to be involved, women's organizations, religious and community should also play a role, and the children themselves must be supported with the financial and investment needed so that we break down these taboos and barriers around disability and gender, and speak more openly so that the girls can talk about their fears freely and can seek help. In this also, government, donors, please, the framework are available. Let's use them. The CRPD is available. Its general comment is stressing that no one must be left, no girl must be left without school. And the time is now. The time is now for us to invest in the systems that will enhance the girl child in school and be empowered. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gertrude. Our last panelist for this session is a young activist at the American Institute of Disability and Inclusive Development. Welcome, Daniela Golden. 3 minutes, please.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here sharing with you all. A little bit about myself. I am from Costa Rica, from a rural area of the country. I'm 25 and I'm part of a Latin American network of young persons with and without disabilities, an initiative of the Inter-American Institute of Disability and Inclusive Development, IDI, and also one of the founder members of the global network of young persons with disabilities that we just launched a month ago. I acquired a physical disability when I was 16 in my last years of high school. I was doing it great, friends, good grades, everything was pretty good, and I didn't expect things to change that much for my new condition. But of course it did, affecting my studies, social life, and my mental health as well. We know that the system doesn't adapt to us. We need to adapt to the system, to ask for inclusion and to be included. And that's how I spent the last years of my high school. I'm part of these projects of IDI, Meta, and La Luz de Frida, where we connect with young persons from other countries. We share our experiences and create projects and campaigns to promote the importance of guarantee human rights of persons with disabilities. By the way, my colleagues, they will be sharing about our work on the chat box. So in those projects, I met Irene, a girl with multiple disabilities from Argentina. Now she is 18 years old. She is in the last year of high school. With the pandemic issue, Irene wrote about her experience in a school. So she took from this bad moment a huge opportunity to tell the world about her experience as a girl, adolescent, and young women with multiple disabilities on school years. With the support of the network, she could reach more people to know about her history, but the thing here is that Irene looked for how to be included, how to make classes more accessible, how to have to receive an inclusive education. And she found her own tools to express herself. I started on the activism and had the opportunity to also express myself, to bring up solutions and to find my own tools. But this is not like, it's not like this all the times. There are millions of girls outside with different conditions that increases their barriers and can find solutions, just more walls. Some of them quit their studies, some of them don't even try and doesn't have the same access that we had. From this Latin American network, Meta, and La Luz de Frida, and the global network of young persons with disabilities, we just left behind our childhood. We can relate experiences about education, health, recreation, and other thematic points. We consider ourselves as a big part of the decision-making tables, but having a meaningful participation where we are considered as equals, we need more safe spaces to share with other young persons from around the world our concerns and to come together to bring solutions. Irene created an opportunity telling about her history, expressing how she was feeling on high school and school with the barriers and things that everyone was putting to herself to try to stop her from studying. I came to the activism to find a place to fit, to fight for the inequalities and injustices, to try to make a better and inclusive and accessible world. If we have more of these spaces where we meet other persons, we share our experiences, we have a voice and we are considered as meaningful voices, it will be more bearable to go through and to fight for our rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for sharing, your experiences. Your lived realities should be a wake-up call for all government actors and other decision makers. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the solutions for addressing the barriers that girls with disabilities face in education. I'm now handing over to Charlotte, who will be moderating this discussion on models of inclusive education that have been successful in influencing policy development that promotes inclusive education for girls with disabilities. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks. That was a great panel. I now welcome two speakers who are going to share the inclusive education models that they've been developing, and introduce their organizations who've successfully realized inclusive education for girls with disabilities in Kenya and Sierra Leone, respectively. First, I want to introduce Martin Okio. Martin is the technical advisor on inclusive education for Leonard, Cheshire in Kenya. Martin, since 2013, Leonard, Cheshire has been successfully implementing inclusive education for more than 2,000 girls in 2 large-scale inclusive education projects in the Lake District of Kenya. Can you tell us more about the model that Leonard, Cheshire has developed, and what you have learned that could be taken to scale to promote inclusive education as a national principle for education transformation? And you have 4 minutes. Over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll take us through the Leonard Cheshire inclusive education model with the lessons from various projects on girls with disabilities, inclusion in education across East Africa. Next. As I start, I would like to share with us a say that disability cannot be an afterthought if we hope to truly build back better from the coronavirus pandemic. As we move on to the next slide, this model places the child with a disability at the center. And then all around this child, we have got various interventions. There are actually 6 sets of interventions, and I'll name them not in any order. We have teacher training, then creating accessible learning environment, policy change, community-wide awareness raising and training. Then number 5, child-to-child activities. Then lastly, individual assessment and support mechanisms. Moving over to the next slide. Now we have got these 6 areas of intervention, but again, along them, we have got 3 levels that they operate in. Now we have got the first level, which is at the individual level, where we have got now various specific interventions like identification, enrollment, and functional assessment with the help of Washington Group questions, and specifically the child functioning model. And then at the second layer, we have the family and community, where we involve parent support groups, male mentors, and other persons within the community. Then at the third level, this model is at the level of the school, where we have child-to-child clubs, curriculum differentiation, country working groups, among other interventions. Now, I'll want to pick specific examples across the 6 in my next slide, across the 6 areas of intervention as shown in the approach or model. And because of time, I'll only pick the first one and the last one as examples. 1, we create support networks at school level to ensure continued learner and teacher support. For example, as I indicated earlier, school-based inclusion teams. These are like, it's a governance structure that involves, various actors, including children with disabilities. They sit on those boards. They represent views from their point of view. Then lastly, as an example, there is building capacity of officials, teachers, and head teachers on the use of Washington Group of questions. I mentioned this earlier. This is a very key mechanism that is being incorporated in various surveys to ensure that we identify the functional abilities or limitations of learners, and it's a success in our projects. Move next. Now, that is just as a preview of this approach, and for additional information, you can visit our website as indicated there. Maybe I'll say it, leonardcheshire.org. We have the files section where you will get more details in respect of this model. Next. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for keeping to the time and for a very insightful presentation. And I really appreciated your focus on the voice of the child and the various ways that you've been able to work to ensure that child participation is meaningful in advancing inclusive education. I would now like to turn to Tiange Gonde, the Program Manager for Site Savers in Sierra Leone, who has been overseeing the country's inclusive education program, Education for All. From piloting the inclusive education model in 2013, the project has reached over 800 children with disabilities, specifically children with visual impairments. Tiange, please tell us more about Site Savers' approach to ensuring inclusion and share your reflections on what must be considered to ensure education programs are gender responsive. And you have 4 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charlotte, for that introduction. I will give a brief overview of the inclusive education program in Sierra Leone and share our learnings. Next slide, please. Site Savers Sierra Leone works with the government to support children with disabilities through an integrated education program. And we've piloted a 3-year inclusive education module in 45 schools in Bombali and Karine. And we targeted 350 children, 200 girls and 150 boys. With this, we have successfully been able to reach 826 children with disabilities, of which we have 432 girls. Next, please. In Sierra Leone, children with disabilities are often left behind and considered not worth educating. Some of the key barriers are as follows. I'll concentrate on 3. Discriminatory social attitudes and practices towards children with disabilities in schools and communities. Girls with disabilities face increased risk of violence if traveling to schools alone. They are less likely to have accessible toilets and support to menstrual hygiene. Some of the girls from our project share that they were bullied because of their disability and struggled to access the same facilities such as toilets. And I just want to read a quote from one of our female learners. She's saying that I cannot walk well and people laugh at me because of my physical problem. Those are the things that they face in school. We have other challenges also which have to do with cost of education, and that means parents normally don't see the relevance of their children going to school because of their disability, and also presuming that they will have poor education or cannot learn at all. Next slide, please. The Education for All program in Sierra Leone has a goal wherein we're saying we want to increase access to inclusive education for children with disabilities, and we have 3 outcomes. One is to improve teaching in inclusive education, also strengthen education systems to include children with disabilities, and strengthen government commitments to promote inclusive education. Next slide. Our approaches. We're looking at 3 key approaches that we have. Pan-disability approach. Before this time, we used to focus mainly on just blind and visually impaired children, but now we're looking at a broader scope wherein we include all forms of children with disabilities, and this has brought a lot of improvements in the enrollment of children with disabilities in different schools that we have. We're also gender focused. We're encouraging parents to bring in their girls who are disabled because most of them think that they are not fit for education, and some of them are kept in the homes and hidden in the communities. So we're focusing on gender to ensure that they bring these kids to school. Our approach is also community-based because we ensure that we include all the different stakeholders in the community, and they work with us to ensure that we bring these children to the different schools that we have in Bombali and Karine district. Looking at our main strategies, we do consult and lots of participatory work being done. We relate more with the local and national government structures, and we also look at evidence-based and learning-focused strategies. With all of this, we've been able to reach 1,035 pupils as I speak, and we have 603 girls with disabilities among this number. Next slide, please. Our key achievements, now we're looking at more girls with disabilities are now in schools since we started this program in 2016. We have more girls in schools now. And also the mothers clubs are helping us to raise awareness in these different schools. And we have 30 mothers clubs, and they are helping us to counsel these children, especially the girls, on menstrual hygiene. And there are schools that don't have female teachers. So these mothers help us to do this counseling within the schools who don't have female teachers. And some of these women also have children with disabilities, and they're also supporting their own children through the learning income generating activities that we have. We've also been able to provide hygiene kits for 396 adolescents, girls with disability. We have improved accessibility, wherein we have refurbished classrooms and constructed separate toilets for both boys and girls. Next slide, please. Our research learnings. We have done 3-phase participatory research on how boys and girls with disabilities experience education. And we have key learnings from those 3 researches. It is important to understand the complex of intersectionality of gender and disability. The impact should be recognized at all stages of an education process. We also found out that both disability and gender intersect with social and cultural contexts. Collecting context-specific evidence is also very, very important. Gender impacts children's engagement with education. It's important to consider in developing school curricula and school environment. Next slide, please. With relation to our key recommendations, looking at the intersectionality approach that we have, we think that they should consider impacts of gender on experiences of children with multiple and different disabilities in different social contexts. Looking at quality and access, our program has proven that if we invest in quality, i.e. teacher training, particularly for female teachers, they'll be able to impact the children, the learning in the schools, because the teachers' skills and confidence has also been improved from the different trainings that we've had for the teachers. In terms of collaboration, we should include community-based actors, for example, the OPDs and parents groups in decision-making for community engagements. In relation to data, we're thinking that the data is very, very important, and we need to promote and implement IE policies, which would integrate inclusive data in IMIS and evidence for planning and decision-making. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Amazing. Thank you, Tige, for such a powerful, presentation and powerful approaches. So if I may ask, what do you think is needed to scale up inclusive education models to ensure more girls and boys with disabilities can realize their potential to learn? And I just want to ask the 2 questions so that you can respond to them, at once. So the next question is, what one commitment would you like to see governments make at the Global Education Summit? 5 minutes, please.
All right, thank you very much. In terms of scale up for girls and boys to fully reach their potentials in schools, I think we need to invest heavily in teacher training programs within the country. For example, in Sierra Leone, we don't have any college that has a course on inclusive education or whatever it is. We only have one private college, which is owned by the Catholics, that has a special needs department. And so I think for us to have proper inclusive education programs within the country or wherever, we need to invest in teachers, because teachers are the ones that are supposed to be teaching the children in the classrooms. So they are not trained to take care of these children with disabilities, then the children cannot learn the way they're supposed to. So I think that we should be able to invest in teacher training heavily so that this can happen. The other question you asked me was
the one commitment.
Yeah, the one commitment. Okay. For us in Sierra Leone, we have just validated and approved the radical inclusion policy, which has to do a lot with inclusive education and children with disabilities and other forms of vulnerable children. So my take is that they should be able to implement the action plans within that policy. If the action plans within the policy are implemented, then we'll achieve inclusive education in Sierra Leone.
Amazing. Thank you, Tige, and also for keeping time. So thank you to you and to Martin for sharing, some examples of good practice in 2 low-income contexts in sub-Saharan Africa. So as we move forward, kindly to speakers, allow me to interject just in case you exceed the time allocated. I would now like to introduce a session on how new and existing national and international education financing mechanisms can become more disability inclusive. The session will explore how national governments can ensure that policies, sector plans, data systems, and budgets can prioritize efforts to ensure that all girls, including girls with disabilities, are able to access and thrive in education. It will also explore what can be done to ensure that new global financing mechanisms, such as the Girls Education Accelerator, integrate a specific focus on disability inclusive education from the outset. We are joined by Dr. Elias Abdi, the Director General from State Department for Early Learning and Basic Education Kenya, George Colling, Education Specialist at the Global Partnership for Education, and Jennifer Ring, Executive Director, GCE, United States. They will discuss how gender responsive and disability inclusive education could become more prominent in government programs and global education financing mechanisms so that we can accelerate progress towards achieving 12 years of quality education for all, especially those such as girls with disabilities who are being left farthest behind. So after the three speakers have introduced the topic, would like to open the discussion up to the audience. So please keep posting your questions. We will respond to them. Add your name and organization, please. So to my first speaker, Dr. Abdi. How is Kenya planning to strengthen budgets and finance to support the implementation of its inclusive education sector plan as part of the recovery plan for education after the devastating school lockdowns in 2020 and 2021? Please, you have 2 minutes, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Sarah Musau. I am pleased to be with you to discuss this important topic, which is very dear to the hearts of us here in the Ministry of Education. And therefore, I'll start by, first of all, I have prepared a small presentation. I'll just go through it very fast. Of course, I have to be sensitive of time. So if I can go to the next slide, please. All I just want to say is, as a country, we have ratified so many international conventions and treaties, because Article 2 of the Constitution of Kenya says that any treaty that we have ratified becomes part of the law. Among them, of course, is the Salamanca Statement of 1994 that talks of inclusive education. And to us, inclusive education is very critical, the Sustainable Development Goal and all that. So when we talk of education for all, what we are talking about is schools for all. We are talking about curriculum for all. And we are talking about learning for all the children included. And therefore, we are sensitive of that. And at the planning stage, we have talked about the education sector plans. We take on board all the children, including children with disability, and we take on board inclusive education at that level. And therefore, none of our children are taken as an afterthought, in terms of planning for the education. Then I would say we move to the next slide. So as a country locally also, we have come up with so many, domestic laws and legislations. Among them are the Constitution of Kenya, especially the Bill of Rights, is very robust. All children have to be taken care of in terms of the right to education. Gender in education policy that the ministry has come up with. We have a specific sector plan for learners and trainees with disabilities. The National Education Sector Plan, and the National Education Policy equally talk about this. And therefore, we have put all the required instruments in place. An example is the school re-entry guideline, for example, that allows girls, even when they become pregnant, to still come back to school. And they can still go back to the same school where they were. If they want to be taken to another school, we provide also the opportunity. We also have a mentorship policy in place that we have put in, as a country. The other thing I just want to say is the affirmative action programs that we have put in place. If you can go to the next slide. We have, for example,
yes. You have 1 minute, please.
Okay. Then I'll summarize. All we're saying is in terms of gender responsive education and in terms of, inclusive education as a country, we have put all the legislations in place, all the requirements and interventions that make these children conducive, it makes them, the school environment conducive for them. An example is the sanitary towels that have supported the girls, retaining them in the schools and all that. We have lowered grades, for example, for children living with disability and girls when it comes to university education, and that has really assisted them. So all I just want to say is on the funding model, we have tried on above and on top what we give other children, we also give top-ups, what we are calling top-ups. For example, a child in primary education gets an extra $23 and secondary school, we give $200 for children living with disability. We have school feeding programs and a number of interventions targeting mainly the children living with disability. So in terms of budgeting and financing, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Abdi. My next question is directed to George Collin, who is the education specialist at the Global Partnership for Education. George, what is being done to ensure that girls with disabilities are being reached through this new global financing mechanism?
Thank you so much for the
Girls Education Accelerator. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. Let me just briefly introduce the Girls Education Accelerator, which, as you said, is a new thematic window and financing mechanism from the Global Partnership for Education. This was created in December 2020 with up to 250 million dedicated to specifically supporting opportunities for girls to attend school and learn, leading to transformational change. The Girls Education Accelerator provides resources to support gender equality in countries and regions when girls' education has been identified as a main challenge. There are 30 countries eligible for this financing, and it basically supports the work and the dialogue that is taking place at the country level. The Global Partnership for Education Engagement in partner countries is based, as the name indicates, on a partnership compact that national authorities prepare with the support of other partners. This compact defines focus areas to deliver transformational and substantial improvements to the education sector. External support, including from GPE, is expected to align to these focus areas. Equity and inclusion are at the heart of GPE's vision and linked to the Sustainable Development Goal 4 of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. Making education inclusive for all children, including those with disabilities, is an important part of this aim, reflected in GPE's commitment at the Global Disability Summit in 2018, including to provide results-based financing for the development of inclusive planning processes and to implement inclusive education sector plans. The Girls Education Accelerator builds on these objectives and commitments by providing additional financing that first strengthens incentives for the hardwiring of girls' education into education sector discussion and financing, including an incentive to include girls with disabilities or plans that discuss girls with disabilities in these program proposals. It increases results-based financing by providing additional resources and by, in some cases, taking the grant threshold above the required variable part. And third, it's important to remember that the Global Partnership for Education...
Excuse me, George. Yes? You have 1 minute, please.
Yes. As I was mentioning, third, it's important to remember that the Global Partnership for Education, including the Girls Education Accelerator, is intended to empower countries to select their priorities and the best way to approach these priorities in a coordinated fashion. Therefore, it is through the strong voices of the different partners in this call and the different participants at the country level that we can better reflect the importance of inclusive education in the Girls Education Accelerator, in the work that GPE does, and in the broader sector initiatives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, George. The last question is directed to Jennifer Rink, who is the Executive Director at GCE US. So Jennifer, how can existing barriers to inclusion in global financing of education be be addressed. And I will just ask you two in one. So how can existing barriers to inclusion in global financing of education be addressed? And what role can civil society partners play in advancing inclusion in global education? Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this event, and especially thank you for inviting me to join you all today. As a woman born with visual disabilities and also the parent of children with learning disabilities, gender responsive and disability inclusive education is very personal, and we are all impacted, as we've already heard today. Issues of inclusion cannot be addressed if they are not recognized by all of us. So events like this allow for important issues around equity and inclusion to be addressed publicly, but it must not stop there. We must fully fund this work today and in the lead up to the Global Education Summit next week. It is urgent that all policymakers take 3 steps now. 1, fully fund the Global Partnership for Education, or GPE, for gender responsive and also disability inclusive education for the full 5-year period highlighted at the Global Education Summit. Building on Jorge's outstanding work that we just heard about, it is critical that 100% of GPE, donor, government, and public funding be specifically designed working with youth with disabilities, teachers, and disabled people's organizations to reach girls and all children with disabilities. No more small pilot projects here or there. It must be fully scaled up to reach all children with disabilities and all girls. We know that what gets measured is often what gets funded and gets done. Intentionally disaggregating data for gender and ability and fully engaging locally based disabled people's organizations and organizations focused on inclusive education, starting with program design all the way through implementation and evaluation, can help to ensure that programming is truly gender and disability inclusive. All education programs, including early childhood education and interventions right from the start, building on with colleagues in the health sector, for example, need to understand in real time to collect and report data that is disaggregated by gender and disability, so we can understand what is preventing girls with disabilities in each local context from accessing education and actively and immediately overcome those barriers. Third, COVID-19 back to school plans and education recovery strategies must prioritize disability inclusive and gender responsive education, including increased sustained funding for children with disabilities, teachers, and education support staff, as well as caregivers, as mentioned today in the Q&A box by Natasha. Thank you for your question. In terms of the role that civil society partners can play, at the Global Campaign for Education US, we're proud to represent and partner every day with a coalition of more than 80 national and community-based civil society organizations and advocates, and we work to promote quality, inclusive education as a basic human right. Please join us, as well as our sister coalitions nationally, regionally, and globally. With our partners around the world, we have joined forces to create the inclusive education and early childhood community of practice. All civil society organizations, advocates, and partners are invited to join, and we'll share the specific link in the chat box to make that easy for everyone to do so. Thank you again for your action, and please join us in accelerating progress and fully increasing funding for gender responsive and disability inclusive education.
Thank you, Jennifer, and also for keeping time. Yeah. So after these rich inputs, I would like to invite our other panelists as well as our audience to post questions or make comments in the Q&A box. Please remember to mention your name and the organization that you represent. We are especially keen to hear from youth advocates. So the first question from the audience is directed to Dr. Abdi. And the question is, what needs to be done to ensure that additional resource allocation promoting inclusive education is directly spent on children with disabilities and not institutional structures and administrative costs? Welcome.
I think the question is straightforward. What is important is at the point of planning, at the point of sector planning, all this has to be done. Because when you have, textbooks, for example, the children will require adapted material. And so when we are providing textbooks to all the students, we should also provide alongside that the children with disabilities so that these children don't become an afterthought. In terms of, for example, a mathematics textbook in grade 3, if you have to convert it into Braille, you know, it becomes maybe one textbook and end up becoming 7 textbooks. You know, it is very expensive. And so what is important is targeting. We need to target these children. And that is the plan. At the point of planning, at the point of budgeting, at the point of monitoring, we should ensure that we provide the children all the facilities they require alongside the rest. And I just want to point it out. These children have right to education just like any other child. Nobody's doing them a favor. These are constitutional rights. These are God-given rights. And they have to be given and supplied with teaching and learning materials, you know, teachers, all that they require by government. And I think that is a responsibility. What is important is proper planning and proper, you know, provision of the items that are required. Asante. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Abdi. The next question is directed to George. So out of the $150 million, what is the percentage specifically set aside to girls with disabilities, and how are these resources accessed?
Thank you.
From Ishmael.
Yes, thank you, Ishmael, for your question. There is no allocation per priority, but rather the allocation is set by country and depending on the country's population size, school age population size. So countries will access this financing and then determine their priorities at the country level.
Okay, short, you know, concise and precise. Thank you.
Well, it was a very good question. So
yeah,
thank you so much.
All right, to Jennifer. How can existing barriers to inclusion in global financing of education be addressed? Sorry. I think you've just tackled that. So sorry, just a little time. So what needs to be done to ensure that most of every additional resource allocation added to promoting inclusive education is directly spent on a child with a disability? Jennifer? You're on mute.
My apologies. Can you quickly repeat the question, please?
So the question is, what needs to be done to ensure that most of every additional resource allocation added is added to promoting inclusive and sorry, I'm just trying to get the question also. So what needs to be done to ensure that most of every additional resource allocation added to promoting inclusive education is directly spent on a child with a disability?
Great, thank you so much. And I mentioned very briefly that need to help us all shift from the global to the local, away from just small pilot projects that might reach one specific population. That's a wonderful first start, but we must actively scale up to ensure the right to quality inclusive education for all young people, for all children, for all learners. So for example, one thing that we've seen successful is to start immediately. Don't wait until a young person would reach school age and already be excluded from school. Or in the case of adolescent girls with disabilities, especially as we're seeing during COVID, if one barrier or a series of barriers mean that a young woman who was in school no longer is able to access school, that might mean that she's not then able to return to school post-COVID as well. And immediate gender responsive, disability inclusive support is needed. So we have to, across the education sector, partner with health, nutrition, other sectors, and ministries to make sure that from birth onward, girls with disabilities, all children with disabilities are fully included, are fully counted as well, so that they can then access education and all systems for support. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. This next question, I'll direct it to a youth advocate, and that is Daniela Gordon. So Daniela, recommendations are often not implemented. What do you think other countries should do differently in order to ensure girls with disabilities is really promoted? What do you think other countries should do differently in order to ensure girls with disabilities is really promoted?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Sure.
Over the course of the session, we have heard a number of recommendations for the Global Education Summit. I will try to summarize here what we consider to be the most important. We want to see a fully funded global partnership for education to help us achieve SDG 4 and SDG 5. With this funding, GPE must demonstrate a strengthened commitment to equity and inclusion when it comes to funding. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we recommend urgent action and funding to tackle the digital divide, especially for learners with disabilities. 2, COVID-19 back-to-school plans and education recovery strategies must prioritize disability-inclusive and gender-responsive education. This includes greater investment in the training, development, and recruitment of qualified teachers and educational support staff, especially female teachers. 3, when developing and implementing education funding packages and strategies, we recommend meaningful partnership with and funding for youth with disabilities and youth-led OPDs. None of this can be addressed without considering intersectionality and data. We recommend a stronger consideration for the ways in which gender norms influence learners' experiences of education. For example, the different experiences of boys with disabilities compared to girls, and for children with complex disabilities and diverse learning needs. Collect, analyze, report, and increase funding for data that is disaggregated by gender and disability. Quality, consistent, and standardized data will help us understand what prevents boys and girls with disabilities from accessing education and what can be done to overcome these barriers. 6, as a cross-cutting recommendation, we demand that GPE partner with community-based actors, including CSOs, OPDs, religious leaders, parents, young activists, and youth-led OPDs and networks. Young people should always have a seat at the table. This is our future, and we must be involved in decision-making processes. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Daniela. Indeed, this is about our lives, so we must be, involved in decision making. That's amazing. So I want to put a close to this session and say thank you to our speakers and audience for your great questions. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Elaine Green, who is the Global Head of Influencing at Leonard, Cheshire, to summarize the main arguments emerging from the discussions today and come up with key recommendations to be put forward to the government leaders who will be participating in the Global Education Summit starting on 28th July 2021. Welcome, Elaine.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for those fantastic presentations and interventions. I think I'm not going to try and capture everything that was said, because it's just not possible for me to do justice to all of the excellent contributions in the last few minutes before we close the session. But there are a few points that I just wanted to highlight that I think reinforce the recommendations that Daniela has just shared. So the first point is that whilst we're seeing some progress towards better inclusive education for children with disabilities, there's still a really long way to go to make sure that girls and other children with disabilities are gaining the same level of quality education as both boys and their non-disabled peers. And I think what we've seen over the last 14-16 months is that the COVID pandemic has just served to further ingrain what were existing social and economic barriers that both girls and children with disabilities were already facing. And so what this means is that we really need to redouble efforts to get girls with disabilities back into school. And I think this is a message that really needs to be heard at the Global Education Summit coming up next week. It's absolutely critical that all children get back into school, but particularly those who are especially vulnerable, such as girls with disabilities. The second thing that I feel this session has highlighted is not only the urgency of getting boys and girls with disabilities back to school, but it's also shown very clearly that actually we have the means and the knowledge to do this. So we've seen with the examples from our colleagues from Leonard, Cheshire and from Site Savers that we have proven models of inclusive education that work. We've heard from our colleague from Kenya that there are policies in place to support inclusive education, yeah, so there are policies in place to support inclusive education, and we know what to do to make sure that children with disabilities are gaining a quality education. We've also heard from the GPE about the new Girls Education Accelerator, and this is just one amongst many financing mechanisms that exist that we should be leveraging to make sure that girls with disabilities can get into school and can receive a quality education. And I think by leveraging these funding opportunities and using these to scale up the proven success stories that we've heard about, we can make much more rapid progress towards the already off-track SDG 4 and SDG 5. And then sort of I suppose my last take-home message from this session is that we have a real opportunity to take action for girls with disabilities now. We have the Global Education Summit coming up. The recommendations that Daniela just shared will be something that we take forward through our various organisations to that summit. And also, so this session doesn't end here either. So we will be sharing a recording of this session during the Girls Education Day that is taking place next Monday as part of the run-up to the Girls Education Summit. And we will also be engaging with all of our key stakeholders to get them to take the messages we've shared today into the Girls Education Summit next week. And then we hope that this session and the Girls Education Day on Monday will be another opportunity to call on heads of state, donor agencies, ministries of education, and all other key stakeholders joining the summit next week to listen to our recommendations and to take action to ensure girls with disabilities are not left behind in efforts to reach SDG 4 and 5 by 2030. And I think just to really reinforce what Daniela just said, I think we need to see a fully funded global partnership for education that really puts girls with disabilities and at the centre, and that really addresses those intersectionalities between gender and disability. We want to see we want to see COVID-19 back to school plans, recovery plans, really addressing the gaps, and particularly the digital divide that we've seen growing. And I think really importantly, I think as Daniela highlighted, and as hopefully we've shown through the voices of youth activists in this session, it's really critical that young people with disabilities are included as partners in efforts to really make a big difference for girls with disabilities and make sure that they're not left behind. And I think that was all I had to say really. So I'll hand back to you, Sarah, for any final comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elaine, for such a summary, and also to Daniela for the recommendations. We as youth, with the disabilities, hope these recommendations will reach the government leaders next week. So this has been a very powerful session, and we are coming to its close. And so it's now my pleasure to invite Antara Gaguli, Director of the UN Girls Education Initiative Secretariat, and one of the co-sponsors of this event, to present closing remarks. Welcome, Antara.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to all of the young activists who have joined this panel discussion and are here with us today in the audience. We stand in solidarity with you. My name is Antara Ganguly, and I am the head of the Angai Secretariat. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to close out this inspiring event today. I want to thank Leonard, Cheshire for convening the space, along with us at Angai, Sightsavers, the World Bank, and GCE US. It is the words of the powerful young women advocates that have really resonated with me today. They have spoken to us about issues of violence, the impact of the digital divide on children's ability to learn, and the harsh reality that we face today, which is that the COVID-19 pandemic really has rolled back the progress we have made on the rights of children everywhere to a quality education. Right now across the world, we know that there are millions of children, especially girls, and especially girls with disabilities, who may not be able to go back to school. But do we even know what this number is? Do we know how many boys and girls with disabilities are left out of data collection efforts altogether? We need this data. We need this data because we need a deeper and more nuanced understanding of how children and young people with disabilities have experienced the pandemic. And what will it take for us to move to a world where these children, especially girls, will be able to go back to school and learn with dignity and in safety. This takes us to the root of what education should be about: recognizing and fostering an understanding of ourselves, our communities, and our societies, including an understanding of those who have diverse and intersecting identities. Understanding that there is a heterogeneity in lived realities of learners with disabilities, and supporting every child's individual right, every child's needs, and every child's agency to learn. Today, young people have raised their voices. Are we listening? In COVID-19 back-to-school plans and education recovery strategies, children with disabilities, especially girls, must be prioritized. They must have a seat at decision-making tables. And not just a seat, but that seat should result in a meaningful partnership in truly listening to their voices, and very importantly, in funding. This year, in the margins of the G7 Summit, of course, through the Generation Equality Forum, and now as we look ahead to the Global Education Summit, young people have been calling for investment in education that shifts power. They are asking us to invest in education that centers gender and social justice, education that is safe for every learner, good quality education, education that centers climate justice, inclusion, and equity. Young people with disabilities have been at the forefront of this. They have raised their voices at every moment and on every platform, and will continue to do so. The question is, once again, are we listening? A fully funded GPE should support us in listening to these voices and taking in their input. Funding for girls' education does not always mean that girls with disabilities will benefit, or even that that funding truly gets channeled to funding for the most vulnerable girls. Enrollment doesn't automatically mean equality and inclusion, and nobody knows that better than a child with disabilities. Therefore, we must make specific commitments and show how we are making these commitments to increase learning, to increase completion, to increase attendance for learners with disabilities, especially girls. There is a need for GP commitments to center equity and inclusion, to show targeted and equitable allocation of funds to reach the most vulnerable children, especially girls and especially learners with disabilities. There need to be targets, and there need to be frequent monitoring against those targets on disability and gender, disaggregated data with measures and commitments so that we all know where we stand on the pledges that we have made. We cannot allow another year of no education. We cannot allow another year of children and young people with disabilities being sidelined. We stand with the World Bank, Sightsavers, Leonard, Cheshire, the Commonwealth Children, Youth with Disabilities Network, the UK government, the Global Partnership for Education, the Inter-American Institute of Disability and Inclusive Development, and GCE US in our commitment to build back equal and inclusive. We are listening, and we must continue to listen. Thank you.
Amazing. After such closing remarks, I cannot add anything. I would just say thank you so much for listening to me and to, for being part of this event. Until next time, have a good evening, have a good day. Bye-bye.